Look, I just want to welcome everyone here to this webinar, Helping Young Children with Their Fears and Worries with Madeleine Winter, and want to acknowledge that we are on Bidjigal land that was never ceded, and the Bidjigal people took care of our lands, our seas and our waterways, and they have a rich cultural tradition that continues today. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'm not sure why my face isn't showing, but that's okay. Again, this meeting's being recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel. At the end of Madeleine's presentation, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can pop them into the chat box and we'll be reading them towards the end of the presentation. I think that's it. Is there anything you need from me, Madeleine, before I get off?
I don't think so.
Okay, and that's a mystery. Okay, thank you. So we've never had that before. Okay, thank you so
Great.
much. Okay.
So, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy work as parents to be here. We are talking about helping young children with their fears and worries. And before we begin, as Carolyn has just outlined, you're all silent. If you want to ask a question, use the Q&A button, which I think is at the bottom of the screen for you. I hope so. And do feel free to ask questions. If we can't get to them here, I'm really happy to have you book a short consultation with me or email me. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, which is the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that Indigenous culture survives and thrives, and that we have all gained from what they have lost. And welcome, courtesy of Google Translate. Do let me know if I've got it wrong. I'm language disabled. I was just raised with English. So welcome wherever you come from. It's good to be with you. And I like to start here, which is the truth about you. You are a good parent, and you have always done the very best that you can. And it's important to remember that as a parent, you face real struggles and difficulties. And you're not to blame for these. The world is really not set up to support parenting. And we can very easily end up feeling like it's our fault, that things aren't going well, or the case in point being children who are scared. Our child won't go in the swimming pool for the swimming lesson or whatever it is. And it's really not. The swimming pool is a great example of where children often feel fear. And if there were only an understanding of that process, they would, it could be an opportunity for them to easily recover from that and build their confidence. But it ends up being this really difficult thing where you might spend half your time in the car park. And someday you will get a little rest. And this is my dear husband. My friends have a very comfy couch, and that seems to be where he ends up when we are out at their place. After the webinar, we'll send you a recording and some links to resources. And as I said, I really love to actually meet you in person. So feel free to book a short consultation, and I can get a sense of how I might be able to help you and point you in the direction of useful resources. You don't have a lot of time. It's great to be able to get a pointer to exactly what it is you need, so that you can get on with moving things forward with your little ones. And it's important to say this, that we all make mistakes in parenting, and with the best of intentions. It's really not a perfect art. And to some extent, rough enough is good enough. Uh, the approach that I work with, which is hand-in-hand parenting, has a really clear focus on giving you the tools to keep your relationship with your child in good shape. And that ensures that you don't have to do it perfectly. It's really not a perfect art. And I love this little set of slides. This little duck took her little ducklings out for a walk, and they encountered an unexpected challenge, as you do as a parent. And the outcome wasn't great. So, my goal is to help you avoid those parenting fails, but what it is that you really have control over is the recovery from the times where things have not gone well. So my aim today is to help you understand why children become afraid, and how feelings drive behavior. I should put a little car there instead of that arrow. So feelings drive behavior. And that's really important to understand, because we often make the mistake of assuming that the problem is that our kids don't understand. And a lot of the time, they're really clear about what's going on. They just have a lot of feelings about it. And we need tools to help them process those feelings. And those tools will involve ways of playing that build connection and closeness. Really important understanding of where limit setting fits, which is right in the middle of parenting, which doesn't mean that it's mean and harsh and nasty, which is how limits were set for most of us. And so it's hard for us to understand that there's a way of moving things along, which is what limit setting really is. There's a way of interrupting kids when they're off track, which is effectively limit setting. I mean, anytime you're giving guidance, you're setting a limit. Anytime you're encouraging, in some ways, you're setting a limit. So it's ways of playing to build connection, limit setting to help get to the feelings, and then listening to the feelings. And out the other side comes a child who's got more confidence and who can take on challenges. And in order to do that, you need really solid support. And I'll talk a little about that. It's not talked about enough, really. A little bit about me. I've done all sorts of things. I was an office manager, a carpenter, a community organizer, and rather late in the show, I became a parent. And this is my daughter a long time ago, and my dear husband. I became a parent better late than never. It's one of the most wonderful things I've done, hard but good. And I've worked with Hand in Hand for over 30 years. So I had it well under my belt before I had my daughter. And I was confirmed in this way of parenting because nothing she did, it gave me a framework for understanding pretty much everything that was happening. And she knew what she was doing. And that was very reassuring and got me inspired to want to share this resource with other parents. And my daughter is 20 now. So she's big, still parenting, but she's big. And you can learn more. You can visit my website. There's a number of short and longer, but I really recommend the short ones, short online courses that address, that Hand in Hand host and have produced, that address some really specific parenting challenges around limits, aggression, separation, sleep, sibling rivalry. And if you want a bit more information about that, get in touch with me. But those will give you a version of the hand-in-hand approach as it applies to those particular challenges. Just to let you know that issues around aggression, issues around separation, anxiety, and often issues with sleep are connected with underlying feelings of fear. So those are often the behaviours that are driven by the feeling. And you can get some information from my website, and do feel free to get in touch and spend some time with me. Just a short introduction to hand-in-hand parenting. It's an approach which was developed in the US. It's all over the world now. And our focus is on building emotional safety in our relationship with our children. And that involves a number of adult to child listening tools, a couple of ways of playing, which will improve and deepen your child's sense of connection with you, which is the fundamental thing. I'll talk a bit more about that. But using child-directed play to build and reinforce and repair your relationship with your child. And then that provides the balance for what you might call correction, which is the setting of limits. We understand setting limits as a necessary and important part of it's the way that you can get to resolving emotional tensions which are getting in the way of your children thinking well. And being very afraid and not being able to tell that a situation is safe is a way that feelings get in the way of thinking. So we generally need to deal with the feelings, and the thinking follows. And I call this the love triangle because at its base is the support that you're going to need and that you do need in order to parent well. And that's adult to adult support, where you get space and can build what we call listening partnerships, which are listening relationships, quite structured listening relationships, which are about offloading and understanding what's going on and planning for what you need to do next. We don't get a lot of space for that as parents. We get a lot of advice, but there's not a lot of space to work out where we fit in it all and what's really workable in our family, and sometimes just to offload how we feel so that we can think better. And you're doing the most important work in the world. And parenting is emotional. I don't think I quite got that until both two things actually, emotional and incredibly physical with little ones anyway. And you need support, you need time to plan, you need time to think, and you need time to notice and understand the feelings that are cropping up in your life with your kids. Otherwise, it's just difficult to keep going and keep going with warmth and confidence. So a little bit about connection. I like to say that connection greases the wheels of family life. And if you get the balance of connection right in your family, you will be able to navigate the unworkable spots much better and much more productively. When kids feel connected, they're easy to be with. I think connection comes first, and then we're inclined towards cooperation. Um, and one of the things to know about this is that you could spend all day with your child and they wouldn't necessarily feel connected to you. It's a fragile and it can be a fragile and tricky thing. And it can be easily broken by illness, by you being a bit tense, by separations, by stress that's coming in on the family. All sorts of things can break a child's sense of connection. And that's almost inevitable. It's really cool if you understand that and you know how to repair it, which we'll talk about. And the result when connection's broken is that young people basically go off track. I like to use the word off track because it's not that there's bad behavior. Bad behavior, sort of, the problem with that way of thinking about it is that there's an implicit assumption in there that your child is doing this deliberately. And our experience is that they are, in a way, because the behavior is a signal that they're in emotional trouble. And I'd rather call it off track behavior or unworkable behavior. You know, anything that just doesn't make sense is something that may need to be corrected. And the trick is, have you got the connection in your relationship with them to do that correction? I talk about a relationship bank balance. You have a relationship bank balance with each person in your family. Some of them are shared, but basically it's an account in which the what's the word? The currency is connection. And depending on how much connection credits you've got in your relationship bank account, things will go more or less badly. So when there's not a strong sense of connection, there's often a lot of struggles and limits and difficulties. And then when there's a high level of connection in your relationship with your child, there's a lot more closeness and cooperation. And the credit is what, when you need to set a limit, you borrow from the credit. So it's an important insurance policy, like any decent bank account would be. So just to sort of clarify what connection is for young people, it's where children feel safe and heard and seen and understood and accepted. And in our busy lives, it's easy for us not to pay enough attention to that. We can intend it and love them very deeply, but it turns out that it's something which has to be created, maintained in order for things to go well. And those things are more likely when we slow down, when we have the patience to listen. And in particular, play is phenomenally powerful as a way of building a connection with a young one. If you play with a young one, especially around something that they want to do, and you let them be in charge, pretty much then you're friends. It's a marvelous thing. It's important to understand that every child has fears. It's really pretty scary being a little person in a big person's world. And young ones are constantly on their learning edge, where they're trying to tackle experiences that they don't have any past experience as a point of reference for. So it's really emotionally challenging. It would be very easy for them to feel scared. In addition, they may be bringing quite big experiences of that were frightening. Sometimes children have had a hard birth, or they've had a lot of illness, or there's been a significant separation in the family somehow. Um, not to talk about, well, yes, any experience for which they're unprepared can generate a lot of feelings of fear. Harshness, threats, violence, as I was just about to say before, not to say war, and natural catastrophes. All of those things will kids are likely to accumulate feelings of fear from. And there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing unusual about that. The fact that your child may be a bit timid, or I'll talk in a minute about aggression, but aggression is often a sign of fear. There's nothing wrong with your child. They're sending you a signal, and the trick is to know how to respond to that so as to help resolve that underlying feeling of fear. The other place that young ones can very easily accumulate feelings of fear are around, you could say, media in general. Even movies that are supposed to be, I very quickly learned that a G rating really doesn't mean anything at all. I remember watching, I think it was the movie Madagascar. It was a cartoon where I think a giraffe, I'm at the other side of the room watching this thing that was supposed to be a children's movie where a giraffe gets its head caught in a train and the train takes off. Well, if you're a young person who isn't yet at the point where they understand, the idea of a story arc and that things happen but they get resolved, or you don't have any experience that can put that information into context, it really can go in as very frightening. It's very literal. They'll interpret what they're saying very literally. So it's worth being really careful about what kids are hearing and seeing. And it's almost inevitable that a whole lot of scary things are wrapped up in what might otherwise be being presented or marketed as suitable for children. I think our culture is not good at telling that things are scary to watch for young people. So often, yeah. The thing is that fears tend not to go away on their own. Children will store scary experiences in their emotional backpack, and those are sitting there waiting to be triggered by new experiences that can be like them or can be somehow connected. The connection is sometimes odd, but it will sit there waiting to be triggered. Basically, this is something that makes all human beings. We all do this. We're all vulnerable here. Our mind goes back to find out what we already know, and what we pull up is the recording of that experience. But if it had a whole lot of emotional tension in it, then that tension comes up as well. And a big feeling of fear can come up around something that doesn't seem to be warranting that at all. The other thing is that I like to call fears sticky. They tend to snowball. So I remember once one of my daughter's friends was really, really, really scared of cats. So when she came over to play, it was quite a challenge to figure out how to have her be relaxed enough to play if there was a cat within the general area, which we have. And I remember talking to her dad some months later, and he said, "Oh, look, we can't go out now. We can't go out to eat outside because now she's scared of birds." And I thought, yes, that's a classic example of how fears get sticky. A feeling of fear comes up. The new experience in front of you will get connected with that feeling of fear. And over time, the emotional backpack gets heavier. And yeah. So, as I've hinted, when children are afraid, it's so very rarely they'll be able to come up to us and say, Mummy, Daddy, I'm scared. Often how they're feeling and the emotional backpack they're carrying around will be betrayed in their behavior. It drives off track behavior. So a child who's really scared may have difficulty, laughing easily or having fun. They may be very serious in their manner. They may tend to withdraw. And we've probably all heard about, the human response to threat, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And basically, moving away from a feeling of fear is our instinct, and behavior, which is withdrawing, timidity, shyness, those things are a sign of a child withdrawing and trying to get away from whatever the experience is that's bringing up the feeling of fear. It's actually really easy to work with in order to loosen things up a bit. Other things that are a sign of a child being scared, if they're really scared, they'll often not want to look you in the eyes, like you'll be holding them and they'll be avoiding your eyes. There's cultural stuff there as well, but it's often if they connect enough through eye contact, they'll probably start to release the feeling. And there's a deep feeling with fear that we don't want to go anywhere near it, which is one of the reasons it sort of sits there waiting to be triggered. Is we try to move away from it, but that actually doesn't resolve it. The leftover feelings of fear, it may get us out of danger. It's a good instinct, but it doesn't resolve the leftover feelings that then get in our way in future. Kids who are really busy, who can't stay still, who are constantly talking, constantly moving, constantly fidgeting, often that's a sign that they're carrying a big load of fear. Bedwetting and night waking are often a sign that a child's carrying a load of fear. What happens around night waking is that a child may actually be pretty good at managing the feelings during the day, but when the part of their brain goes offline, the part of the brain that sort of manages everything when they're asleep, the feelings will often bubble up and will wake young ones. And I have to say, speaking for myself, they wake old ones as well. But that's part of what's happening. And it's not always well understood that that behavior that looks aggressive is often driven by fear. There'll have been a feeling of fear pop up and grab the child, and what that child is trying to do to protect themselves, it's a fight response. So I don't like the word aggression because it assumes that it's intentional. It can look intentional, but it's really that someone's just very, very scared and trying to protect themselves from what they perceive as a threat. And a way to do that is to shift into a position of power, to remind themselves that they're not about to be overtaken by a feeling of powerlessness or helplessness. So that's what drives aggression. It's a shift. Frankly, it's not just children who do that. I think that's what human beings do a lot of the time. If there isn't the connection there to let the feeling break open, people can try to handle it by shifting to being in a powerful position rather than being victim of the feeling or trying to protect themselves from the threat. The fact that it's driven by fear doesn't excuse behavior, but we need to meet that behavior knowing that it's about fear. And little ones can be really clingy, which drives a lot of us nuts. Partly because I think we didn't get to be very clingy. No one had a lot of attention for our fears and worries when we were little. That doesn't help us be relaxed and patient with our children when they are. Also, fears get in the way of routines often. And, it's hard to be relaxed when your child's scared to get out of the house or, get past the dog or something so that you can get out the door to get in the car. So clinginess is a sign that they might be a little afraid. One of the things that young people do is that they'll pick, we call it finding a pretext. They'll pick some really tiny thing to get very upset about. It's how they unpack their emotional backpack. One of the ways they unpack their emotional backpack. And anyone who's got little kids, I'm sure all of you who've got little kids can tell me of a time where they just got ridiculously upset about something that really wasn't that important. Sometimes I reckon that the smaller the pretext, the bigger the feeling. It's like they can't really articulate what it is. They can't quite manage how big it feels, so they make it very, very concrete. And once you understand that process, you can relax around those small hiccups or those hiccups over small things. And if you have the time and the patience, you can actually that they're really great opportunities to drain feelings of fear or anything else. You can trust that it's really about something else. And you don't need to know what it's about. Sometimes you'll have a history, as a parent. I did a lot of this work with families before I was a parent. And the difference in working with my own child, where I knew the details of the story, it made a really big difference. But the reality is, you may never really know what it was that frightened your child this badly, but you can do a lot about how it's affecting them. You don't really need to know that in order to be of assistance to them. So they're often picking on little pretexts in order to drain big feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. Very frightening. And they're looking for a way to be safe, but feel the fear. And working with young ones, or anyone actually, around fear, that's the key, that's the tightrope we need to walk, which is that in order to really recover from fear, children need to know that they are safe. If there's a real threat, that's when we need to not feel anything but get on with getting ourselves out of the situation. And our biology and our psychology is structured that way. Faced with the tiger, we will just get ourselves out of there. And it's not a time to stand still and shake, which is what you might do to keep processing the fear. You have to act. But when a child is safe, and when anyone is safe, then it's an interesting balancing act to get close enough to the fear that they can feel it, but without feeling overwhelmed, and that it actually is real. This is about me as an adult, but as a young adult, just that example of, I went rock climbing and my hair got caught in the rope, in the belay rope, I think it's called. And so I'm hanging halfway up a cliff and someone has to come up and climb up and figure out how to get my hair out. Just a moment, I need to plug in my computer. Sorry. There, the plug wasn't in deeply enough. So, and it wasn't until I got down to the ground and then walked around and up to the top of the cliff and sat down, and then I started to shake. And I remember thinking, that's it. When I'm on the cliff face, anything could happen. I need to have my wits completely about me. But once I got up to the top of the cliff and there was someone sitting next to me and I was completely safe, suddenly I was shaking. And shaking is how we eliminate feelings of fear. That's why you shake when you're trying to do a big speech in front of a big crowd if you're not really used to doing that. When someone is in that state of the feelings are right up, unfortunately, words don't help very much. So we tend to want to reassure our children, and there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that is just the right thing to do. But we are often responding from a wrong understanding of what the problem is when we do that. So the problem with words is that they assume that the person you're speaking to can comprehend and understand and make sense of and act on what you're telling them. And that assumes a sophisticated cognitive process is working well. And the problem is that once someone has shown you that they're that scared, that sophisticated cognitive process has gone offline. And what's happened is that they're flooded with feelings. So much of the time when you encounter a difficulty with your child, it's probably not because, I mean, it's always worth giving them some information. Generally, they pretty well know what it is that needs to happen. They're just flooded with feelings. And we sometimes keep at them with information. It's okay, darling. It's okay, darling. I've got your hand. And often, even in our tone, we're conveying a sense of something other than calm and confident. And none of that really helps. They're reading our body language, they're reading our tone of voice, and they actually need to be met emotionally, not with ideas. They need connection and play and certain kinds of setting limits and listening to the upsets that tend to erupt when you set a limit. That is what they need at that point. At some time, it may be worth having when they're not in the middle of a big feeling of fear, it may be worth having a conversation, but conversations are really overrated in my opinion. Often once the fear is gone, the issue is gone. So when we talk about setting limits, I'm not going to talk in detail about limit setting here. You can probably find one of my past webinars on setting limits if you've come through Randwick Council, on the Randwick Council website, or I think it's their YouTube channel. But I've also got quite a bit on my website about limit setting, and you can come and have a chat with me. But yes, I don't know what I was going to say there, something about limits. So we talk about really time in. Wherever we talk about time in and time out, it's time out for grown-ups and time in for children. So children don't need to be left on their own. If you've completely lost it, I think you need to give yourself permission to put a bit of distance between you and your child. But in general, when your child has demonstrated that they're in trouble because they've just hit their brother or sister, or I don't know, won't go in the pool, it's a sign that they've got big feelings of fear up. And when there are big feelings like that, sometimes the problem is that they're disconnected. And if you can connect with them, and play is a really efficient way to do that, it can move them past the difficulty. But when a big feeling comes up, they can't remember that they're connected to you or anyone else as well. They'll signal for help with off-track behaviour. You don't need to fix the problem. It's easier to tackle feelings of fear when you know that there isn't a problem. So, for instance, separation is is a variation on feelings of fear. And when my daughter was going back to preschool after the long summer break, I remember distinctly her starting to get quite agitated in the back of the car. And it was very helpful for me to know that she loved preschool. It helped me to know that there wasn't something in that environment that she was going into that I needed to do anything about, but that she was simply having feelings about having been close and connected for the long summer break, and that she was going to be leaving me to go to this other thing. So then I could relax and just, there are some normal feelings about separation here. Let's do something about those. Let's listen to her about those. So we spent a bit of time in the car park doing what we call a long goodbye. But it's a similar principle, which is you'll bring the idea up, honey, I'm going to go. I know. I know. You wish we could be together. I'll always come back to you, but I'm going to go now. And you do that without actually leaving, in order that she can feel the impending separation, which is a feeling of fear, and and but you're close and connected and there, and that gives her the safety to feel it. So you don't we need to fix the problem a whole lot less than we think we do. I think biologically we're really kind of driven to go into fix up mode, and that's a fine thing, but it's a little bit rigid. And sometimes what we need to do is just bring a limit. I'm trying to think of that. Yeah, we're going to do a swimming lesson today. Yeah, there's the pool. Yeah, there's water. Wah, wah, wah. That's a limit. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about limits as expectations. Expectations held the right way are a kind of limit, as well as limits that are more about stopping something from happening. But you don't need to fix. You can bring a limit, which is a way of interrupting whatever the off-track behavior is, and connect with your child. And then what happens is there'll be an upset. Upsets are part of the process. They're part of a sign that things are moving forward, which is not what our culture tends to think. And you might need to move your child somewhere where you're not going to get criticized for them being upset. But basically, upsets are a sign that things are generally a sign that things are moving in the right direction. And all you need to do is listen and stay close. And once that process has done its thing, thinking tends to follow. Little ones will be able to do what they need to do. I remember picking up my friend's little boy from preschool. His brother was about 5 years old, so the family was going through the whole saga of starting school, which was quite stressful. So the family was quite stressed. And this little boy got into the car when we were picking him up, and about 2 inches down the road, he's climbing out of the car seat. And he knows he needs to be in the car seat. And his mum had the great instinct to stop the car, go round to the passenger side seat, open the door, and just say, "Sweetheart, you need to be buckled up in your car seat." And he just wailed and wailed and wailed. I'm thinking, oh, we're going to be here for hours. Actually, that time it only took 5 minutes or so. And then he was just ready. He actually was put his arms inside the harness. So he needed to just unload this bunch of feelings that were to do with a hard day, being away from mum and his family for the whole day, probably connected with the whole level of stress the family was under with starting school. that's a whole other story. And he was able to think. And that's what happens. If you can get through the fears, sometimes it takes more than one go, but you can get there. Where so long as what's proposed makes sense, they'll be able to cooperate. So when children feel safe, what happens is an emotional release. It's like when I got to the top of the cliff, I started to shake. I couldn't have stopped myself shaking. It's what our bodies do in order that our brain won't be completely clogged up by the feeling. It's a kind of elimination process. So once children feel safe, and you'll see little ones do this, they'll fall over and then they'll get up and they'll look around to see if you're there, and they'll head for the safest person, and then they'll start to have a big upset. It's like they need to find home base, and you need to somewhere where they're anchored so they can go deeply into the feeling and be kept safe while they go there. So tears release stress and grief. Tantrums are actually the expression of feelings of frustration, which little ones experience a lot of frustration because they're constantly in new learning environments where they're trying to do more than they have the experience to help them do. So they're right on their learning edge. It's good for us grown-ups to try learning something new every now and again, to kind of be reminded of how hard and excruciating that is. There's this excruciating feeling where you can't quite do what you know you ought to be able to, or will be able to, if once you master it. You've got to get that those feelings of frustration are best eliminated, and a tantrum is the way that happens. They're fast and furious. Often people will call what children do tantrums when they're actually a much more deep feeling of fear. Anything that goes for much longer than a few minutes is probably a child trying to work through fears rather than frustration. And it turns out that laughter, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is a tremendously powerful way for human beings to release lighter fears and embarrassments. And that's why humour works. Humour brings our attention to something that often has some kind of social tension around it, and allows us to laugh about it. And that's because little ones, that's part of why young people will set up laugh fests in the back of the car and start pissing themselves laughing about things that perhaps you can't really see what it is, the point is. And they'll definitely go through phases where they're really desperate to laugh and tell jokes about bodily functions, for instance. And it's because they came into the world completely pleased with themselves, and it's quite bizarre to them that we are so tense about bodily functions, and they can tell there's a whole lot of tension there, and that's frightening for them, and they'll tend to want to try and get a chance to laugh about it. It's why kids laugh when they're being told off, and it's an expression of fear. It's often misread as resistance or contempt, or but it's actually what people do when they're scared. And then sort of sweating and struggle and shaking and screaming are unfortunately how children heal from heavier fears. What's going on there? It's quite physical. And what's going on there is that they're needing to do something forceful and physical to remind themselves that they are now big and strong, and that they're not again going to be overcome by whatever the feeling of being overwhelmed is that they've got in their emotional backpack. So they may have had some experience early in their life where they weren't quite sure they were going to make it through. And in working through that feeling, it's going to be physical. That's often quite challenging for many of us. If we've ever had been physically abused, it can sometimes look, it can sometimes hard for us to stay thinking around that, and we need to be careful of ourselves there, and make sure things are kept safe, because in that place a child doesn't want to cause damage. They're just desperate to get away from that feeling of fear. But if you let them run off, it's like fear will have us moving away as fast as we possibly can, but then it sits there. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how it works. So, in order to get to those places where a young one will actually be able to feel the fear, we are often going to need to set limits. So, I don't know how we're going here. That's okay. We're often going to need to set limits. We call it, as I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about limit setting here, but it's important to understand that it's right in the middle of things. And around working with children who are struggling with fears, it's really interesting. So we call it the warm no. You don't have to be mean and harsh and punishing in the way that you bring limits. You just need to warmly stop something from happening, or hold out a warm expectation. I'll talk a little bit about that. So limits around an aggressive child, for instance, are going to look like you mainly need to make things safe. And it will consist of things like, I can't let you do that, sweetheart. I'm not going to let you do that. No. I know, but no. We generally talk about using 5 words or less for limit setting, because otherwise what you're trying to do is reason with them, which is using a cognitive framework, not an emotional framework. So when children are showing fear in ways that you could label as aggression, you definitely need to make things safe, which means you'll need to get in the way, physically probably. That's a limit for that. And then children who are timid and withdrawn, a limit, an expectation can function as a limit. So, honey, I know you can do that. How about we go and play? Do you want to get in the sandpit? And the problem that we get confused there is that we hope that making the suggestion will give them the idea and they'll be able to do it. And actually, the way it needs to work is that making the suggestion holds out a possibility, and they'll thrash around in front of that. No, 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 mummy, no, 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 money. I don't want to do that. That's them offloading the fear, and they're offloading it up against what you've just given to them, which is a relaxed, high expectation of what they could do. It's important to understand that that's a limit and not get confused that they should be able to do what makes sense. You hold out what makes sense and see if you can get them to get a little closer to it. And then they'll have some feelings about it. They'll probably want to move away from the idea, I don't want to go in the sandpit. I want to, and you can just hold it at that spot. I know. It's fine in the sandpit. You're not trying to convince them. You're trying to hold them up against a possibility so they get to feel the fear. So when you do this, you need to expect upsets, because limits, really what they function to do is interrupt off-track behaviour. When you interrupt off-track behaviour, what it does is pull the feelings to the surface. So what will happen is a child, the upsets are almost a necessary part of the process. Offloading emotional tension. The upset is the pathway to cooperation, and particularly when children are working on fears, they will, it's part of the process of finding a pretext. They'll make you the problem. You're the worst mummy ever. You made me do something I didn't want to do, etc., etc. And you need to regard this as a badge of honor. You are safe enough for them to turn you into the problem, because they can't really get their brain around the real problem. They need to make it concrete so they can feel the fear. And in that spot, young ones will need to fight. And I've said that they'll target you. And your job is to keep it safe. And if it's getting physical, hang in there as long as you can. But if that you're not much used to them, so then you want to figure out how to get yourself out of that situation. So handling that sort of thing, you're really going to need someone to talk to about how it feels to hold your child up against a feeling like that, how irritating it is that they have to have all these feelings about something that's really fairly straightforward. It's nice in the sandpit, whatever the story is. We just need time to just offload how we're feeling. And we teach a tool called listening partnerships, which is a structured listening relationship that will give you a space where you can do that. So when your child is upset, what you're doing is what we call stay listening. You're the safety manager. So when they're in this space, they can't take care of safety. They can't remember not to flail their arms around and it happens to run into grandma's antique vase. They won't be able to, you may need to hold them close so that they can't fling their arms about and hurt you. You'll need generally to stay close. You can, if they're not on a trajectory to cause real damage, if you've lost it and they'll run away, so long as they're safe, that's okay. They just won't be able to stay feeling it and processing the feeling and getting rid of the feeling so it doesn't sort of clog up their thinking without a sense of you being close. When a child is in that spot, they need to be free to do what we call freedom of the mouth. They will say the most atrocious things. It gets tricky if another child's around and they're kind of saying atrocious things about the other child. So you may want to relocate, but we call it freedom of the mouth. They don't mean it. They don't mean it. They don't want to be mean, but they sort of need to, it's part of the process of making this big feeling concrete. And it's important that you don't take it personally. You also, as I said, you don't necessarily need to fix the problem. You know, the water's too cold. The water's too cold. The water's too cold. If you're in a situation where you can just stay there and say, yeah, but you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Then you don't need to go and find a warmer pool. I mean, feel free to try the workarounds. Sometimes, I don't know, the situation is sort of different enough that it doesn't pull up that fear and you can get on with whatever it is you were planning to do. But what generally happens, because fears snowball, you'll find that it gets harder and harder and the workarounds get to be more and more work, and in the end it's like you're better off setting a limit rather than running around like a chook with your head cut off, as we would say, trying to fix the problem. Often you'll get a fix and that's not right, and you'll try another fix and that's not right, and it's like, okay, well, we just need to have an upset. So loud words, loud noises, you know, strong words as they get older, stomping around and slamming doors, that's kind of it's part of that process of trying to remind themselves that they are big and that they're not about to be overwhelmed, as well as just, you know, good old-fashioned tears. Most of us understand that tears are a way of releasing sadness and grief, but it's harder for people to understand that fear comes out much more physically. And that is a process of emotional release, and recovery, just like tears. And unfortunately, stopping the upset doesn't make the feeling go away. It just goes underground. And we need to communicate confidence and that we care, but it's good unless the circumstance is such that it's not safe anymore for someone to be having that big upset. I mean, throwing things around in the back of a car is something where you really have to get things safe first. But if you can bring yourself to listen to the outburst and not try to reason with it and not try to tell the child that they need to save themselves and stop being upset, it will help the fear work its way out quicker. And just briefly, I want to talk about the incredible healing power of laughter. It's awfully underrated. It's a great way to help kids feel fear safely, partly because there's something about this kind of play that's deeply connecting. So it does two things at the same time. And one of my colleagues put it like this. I really like this. Fear is like a beach ball. You can try to shove it down under the surface, but it will bob back up again. Instead, we can allow it up to the surface. We can toss it around. We can play with the feelings until they start to deflate. And the tool we use for this is what we would call play listening. So we want to notice what makes a child laugh, and try to set it up that happens again somehow or other. The general principle with play listening needs to be that the child is in charge and they will instinctively find their way to a powerful role if you give a hint that you're prepared to occupy the opposite end. We adults are constantly in the role of directing everything. That actually gets pretty wearing for children, and it's enormously entertaining to them when we willingly and cheerfully try to be the opposite of that. They're not confused. They don't get confused. They know we're in charge. They want us to be in charge, but they need a way to have a bit of a laugh about just how hard that is for that to be that way all the time. And sometimes we're in charge in ways that are a little bit tense and frightening. And when we kind of let go of that rope, kids can have a bit of a laugh about it. So they will be delighted anytime that we can kind of act more scared than they are. You don't want to humiliate. There's a kind of tricky line here, or send up a child, but being more scared than they are leaves them the space to be the knowledgeable one, be the brave one, and that's very useful for them. Any time we can be foolish or stupid or cheerfully bumbling, and if you start noticing, I mean, anytime if you make a mistake in how you say a word, or any number of other things where you're not quite as competent as you usually look, kids will often laugh. So getting to be skilled at finding those spots is very useful. Your general tone needs to be affectionate. It's often a physical playing. Kids love to be tossed in the air. That's play listening. So long as or pushed high on a swing is a lovely example of safe feelings of fear. And often kids will laugh as they get to the point where it's challenging enough and high enough that they can feel the fear. If they go quiet or they start to screech, it means that the situation has started to look like it really is scary, not just that it reminds them of some other fear, and it's the way they can safely release it. So sometimes we tend to get a bit big in the play listening, and we get all carried away with being the grumpy monster, only suddenly we really do look like a grumpy monster, and you'll notice everyone's gone quiet. So your what's the word? Your indicator that you're getting the right balance is that the kids are laughing. One of the things you really don't want to do is tickle, because kids will laugh but they're not in charge. And a process where they're not in charge, or they don't have control, that's not a healing process. So there's 100 different ways to get to this kind of playing without tickling. Sometimes kids will ask to be tickled. And I think that's because most of us got tickled as young ones. And that was one of the only ways people were sort of warm and playful with us. So we kind of took the bad with the good. And that's what we have in our resource kit when we go back to find out what we know about playing. And so we tickle, and kids may ask to be tickled because it may be the only way that adults have been able to be a little bit playful with them. And if that's the case, you'll probably find there's a whole bunch of ways you can get them laughing around the possibility that you might tickle them, but don't actually tickle. So they've got room to run away and you can chase them. Or so they get to feel what it's like to be pinned down and not able to get out, like what it might be like, but they're not actually being pinned down. So I'm going to tickle you. I'm coming for you. So those are some thoughts. All of that kind of play is working on lighter fears. And sometimes I've worked with families that can resolve quite deep indications of fear, like one family I worked with kind of quite serious bedwetting challenge, and they just did a lot of play listening and what we call rough housing, which is rough physical play, but where the child is safe and in charge or just on the edge of that. They're not actually scared. They did a lot of that and the bedwetting resolved. So you can do amazing things with this kind of play. And it is worth knowing that at some point laughter will turn to tears. And that's because the laughter-filled play has brought them closer to you. And sometimes it's really interesting how it happens. Like they'll bump themselves and they'll have a really big upset about having bumped their elbow, and it's really a pretty small injury, but it's like they're connected with you, they can tell you're on their side, and they decide to go to offload some of the feelings that have been hanging around. So final words really are about getting support for yourself. You need a place to download how you feel, to plan, to get support, and to figure out how you're going to make the time for this kind of playing. And listening partnerships are a tool for that, which I can highly recommend. That's a space where you can talk about how you feel about your child's fears and worries, where you can think, how you were treated as a young person will be a lot of what your point of reference is as you try to meet your children's needs. And if that wasn't great, then you'll have some stories to tell about that will unload your emotional backpack, and that will mean you have more flexibility meeting your kids' needs, emotional needs. Listening partnerships also are a great place where you can plan how you're going to tackle something. Like some things around fear in particular, they're sticky, they hang around and keep turning up. We call that an emotional project, and it really needs a plan, and you'll need some support to do that. So a listening partnership is where you take turns listening with another adult. You take equal turns. You listen with warmth. You really try not to give any advice or opinions about their experience. You're just there to listen, and you commit to keeping it completely confidential, and it becomes a place where you can talk about how it really is and then go back into the fray and play. So that's probably what I want to cover today. I'm wondering whether people have any questions before we have to wrap up in a short while.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. That's always so wonderful. I actually had a technical issue and got cut off, but I did see one question in the Q&A box before I got cut off, and I don't know if you have more. But someone asked, how would this apply, these skills apply to someone who was in the early teen years, say 13, 14, 15? And if there were more questions, please type them into that Q&A section in the screen. Ours is at the bottom. I don't know where yours is.
Yes, I'm not sure where mine is here. Okay, you have to tread a little more carefully with adolescents, in my experience. Um, it's easy to end up sort of running the risk of poking at their difficulty if there's something that's holding them up in a consistent kind of way. It's depending on how far into adolescence they are, there's still in early adolescence, there's often still room for you to drop the sort of the parenting role and move into being a bit sillier or a bit goofier. We you might use what we call a vigorous snuggle. It's like actually coming in for a big cuddle, that they might sort of rebuff. And the other thing to say is that doing the work when our kids are younger is much easier because they come out into the world with a pretty intact emotional release process. And what happens as they get older is that gets our society doesn't encourage emotional release and recovery. It's better that people go to the shops and buy things to try and make themselves feel better. So that gets restricted more and more as a person gets older. And there's very little that you can try really hard to keep it safe for a child to have a big cry, for instance, especially boys. This comes in really heavily on boys. But it's going, by the time a child has been in the world for 10 or 12 or 15 years, the first thing that you'll find as you move close to them is that it irritates them. And it's important to understand that you will bother them, but that you don't want to let that put you off. It's a tricky line because if your relationship is full of sort of nagging and demanding, that's going to get in the way. So there's a bit of work to do to kind of make an assessment of how your relationship is generally. But I think that it's still worth trying to find places where you can play and laugh. And sometimes the routines of joking and laughter that you developed when they were younger, they'll call on those. So I think it's less direct. It's in the end, you have to make a judgment about whether or not it's worth holding out that they could be different from how they are. And lots of general hanging out and being close is important as a balance if you do decide that you want to take something on. They're also at an age where you can make the plan with them about how they want to tackle it. The important thing is to remember that when anyone is pushing up against something that's hard, whether that's running faster or making friends, they'll have feelings, and your job is to help them feel that. The other thing to say as people get older is that the process of showing feelings is much more hard fought and tends to be sort of messier and scratchier. It's not got the ease that you may find you have with a younger child, where you can spend some time playing around, doing play listening, or a kind of play we call special time, which is a one-on-one play time, incredibly efficient at building safety. And then soon after that, you may be able to set a limit, and the upset is close and loose and easy and close to the surface, and it doesn't feel like it's hard fought. But once you get to working with people who are a bit older, whether they're adolescents or, and adults, it's even harder. It's just a much more uncomfortable process. So I think you just need to know that. And a good lot of it by this stage is that we're as sick of them and their struggle as they are with their struggle. And for us to have a chance to talk about how infuriating it is that they have a problem, that we haven't been able to figure out how to give them a hand with it, that gets in the way of us being able to actually just be there with them in their struggle, because we so desperately want them not to have it. And we actually need a place where we can go and talk about that, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was coherent, but yeah. Come and talk to me. It does get trickier, and it's important to understand that there's good reasons for that, and you have to pick your battles a bit more carefully, I think.
Thank you. We do have another question, and I'll read it out. In a scenario where they have found, my computer just died.
Oh, I've got it here.
Sorry.
That's okay. I found the right button.
Okay, I've got it. I've got it. Let me keep going. Sorry about that. In a scenario where they have found that a friend was not fair when playing, and they are upset about it and running away from the parent who was trying to console them, do we apply the same principle of, 1, keeping them safe, and 2, set the limit and connect?
Okay. Play dates are really hard. And I think sometimes you just, so if you move in and set a limit and your child has a mighty big upset, and that upsets and concerns and worries the other people around you, or if in that upset your child is likely to say some stuff that will damage their relationship with the other child, I think your strategy probably needs to be trying to avoid the situation, like trying to distract, or this is where play listening gets to be a very powerful tool, because you can touch on it without going directly on it, and often you can involve everyone in the game. So if they're that question just disappeared. If they're chasing, if they're running away, depending on the situation, that lends itself to a chasing game, which if you do with a light tone and some degree of incompetence, depending on how old they are, will turn into something where they can get close to being caught and they'll laugh and run away. And then before you know where you are, everyone will be involved in the laughing game. And that will dissolve the tension in the situation. But I think when a child is having difficulty in a play date and you haven't got the other adult lined up to understand what it is you're going to do, if you move in to let your child have a big upset, it can get tricky. I had a phrase which I found worked remarkably well, was, whoops, we've hit a technical difficulty here. If your child's having a big upset, if you communicate that you're relaxed about it, that often relieves people of their worry, other adults of their worry about it. The other thing about play dates is that they're really complex, and often what's happening, I think, is that kids go to school school is really complicated. There's not nearly enough adult support and resource and assistance. And they come home with a whole bunch of feelings about their relationships with other kids. And when there's a play date and you're there, they're looking for you to give them a hand with that. But it's as soon as you get into a social situation, that's tricky. Sometimes it works really well to front end it with a really big dollop of connection that will help carry them through the play date without running into too much difficulty where they can't think and they get into struggles with the other kid. So you might do a big roughhouse or wrestling match where they're getting to be the winner before your friends arrive, or you may not have to go at it even that directly. I haven't talked here about special time, but it's a marvelous tool. So it's a timed one adult to child, one adult to one child playtime where you just tell the child you'll do whatever they want to do. And I could go on and on about it, but it's a tremendously efficient way to fill up this sense of connection, which may help them navigate the play date better. But whether you let them run off or you move in to provide some kind of limit for there to be an upset, it's a judgment call about whether that's going to work socially. And, your child will give you another chance to help them with that feeling. It's probably not worth losing a friendship over it. And people can get quite upset if it looks like I don't know. Is that helpful?
Sounds really great. Thank you. That's such a comprehensive answer. I don't see any other questions, but did anyone else want to have any last minute questions? We just have a couple of minutes left. This is all really helpful, and that focus on connection and relationship and just keep building that throughout their lives.
Yep.
And it's so great that this information's available for parents now.
Yes. I think, and especially underrated is that laughter-filled play. As I said, it's often a way you can deal with things in social situations. It's a muscle. It's a muscle that's worth building. What you will find, though, in social situations where you do that, it's like if you start looking like you can play that way in the park, before you know where you are, you'll have 5 kids wanting to play. That they're very interested in adults who are prepared to sort of be a bit goofy.
And have fun. And also letting them, it was really new for me, you saying let them be in control of the play. I love that. Yeah, because you can play all those scary games, but if they're in control, whether it's,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. And it's very easy for us to sort of misjudge that line where we get just a bit too big and suddenly it looks real for them. So but they'll try and turn it into them being in charge if you give them a chance. They'll show you how you can be more stupid or harder to find or whatever.
Yeah, and maybe we'll look into next calendar having more conversations about that transition into teens and what that might
happy
look
to
like.
do that. It's one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of parents need that because they're used to one kind of child and then suddenly their child has a metamorphosis and they don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
Speaking from experience. Okay. So we've got a few minutes left, but it looks like there's no more questions over here. And I just want to apologize. What did you say about calmly a technical difficulty? I like that.
Oh, yes. It's a powerful phrase.
Definitely had a few technical difficulties here. Right. I don't know why my camera's on, but I'm not here. But anyway, lots of things I got cut off at one point, but it's still recording. So look, I just want to thank you so much. And we will be sending out Madeleine will be sending out the information on the recording and the opportunity to have a one-on-one with her in an email. It takes a few days to get the recording up on the YouTube, so just be patient with that. So you can listen again and, review it. So is there anything else you wanted to say, Madeleine?
No, as I said, I love to actually meet you. So do feel free to book a little consult, and I'd love to meet you.
Great. Thank you,
All
everyone.
right.
And I'm going to
Thank
stop the
you.
recording.